Hey guys, Jordan here from Zone Off-Road, and today I have a 2022 Chevy Trail Boss diesel, and we're going to be installing our 1 3/4 inch lift kit. Now your first step, once you get it up in the air and your wheels and tires off, we're going to go ahead and remove our tie rod from our knuckle here. So that's a 22mm socket, remove that nut. And then we're going to take a hammer and we're just going to strike the bottom of the tie rod in. And break it out of the knuckle. Now we're going to go ahead and remove our ABS and brake lines from our knuckle. We just have a 10mm socket, and there's one down here, back here, on the side here, and then on the arm as well. So these are all just 10mm. We're gonna reuse most of this hardware, so do not throw it away. Break them all free. This is just going to give us more slack for when we take the strut out. We don't bind those up. And then we're going to turn the knuckle and get this back one out here. Now once you get all those brackets removed, we're just going to go ahead and pull this ABS out of the knuckle. Once again, that's just for more slack, so when we take the strut out and take everything apart, it's not going to rip it. We're going to take a 36mm socket, and we're going to remove this CV nut here. That's just, again, when we droop it out, we're not going to pull that CV apart and rip the boots. So go ahead and remove this. Now we're going to go ahead and remove our caliper from our knuckle and our rotor here. They're just 2 bolts that hold it on. They're 18mm socket to remove. And then just put this up and just hang this up somewhere out of the way. Make sure when you do hang it up that your cord, your line is not tight. And then don't worry about this falling off, because there's a screw that holds it on to the knuckle, so you don't have to worry about messing with both of them as you're taking the caliper off. Now we're going to remove our upper ball joint nut. We're going to take an 18mm socket. You might have to use a swivel to be able to get on there without ruining that nut. And do not take this all the way off. Just take it off enough so you can start to move it with your hand. And sometimes it might pop up like that, like it just did. So in this case, we're going to take a pry bar and we're going to pry down on this arm, because if you loosen this completely, this arm is just going to fling up. So you can see how that movement there. So we're going to go ahead, loosen this, remove that nut, hold your knuckle so it doesn't flop down, and just let that, you might have to push up a little bit. Now once you get your upper ball joint separated from your knuckle, remember we did remove this nut here, so the CV is able to be moved. So make sure that when it's drooping out that it's not, the splines aren't engaged, it's not pulling on that CV. So just make sure that you kind of just give it a little wiggle and just give yourself a little bit more room, because you can see how that's moving that back and forth. If you get too much stress on this, it'll rip that boot and you don't have to get a new boot. So just be mindful of that when you are taking it apart. Now we're going to remove our sway bar link nut from our lower control arm. This is going to be an 18mm socket, and it's kind of recessed in there, so just try to find where it's at. Just remove that nut. Next, we're going to remove these 2 strut bolts here on the lower part of the strut that's connected to the control arm. So when you're loosening these, remember we did loosen and remove our sway bar, so nothing other than the bushings are holding this control arm and everything up. So when you do loosen this, just make sure that it doesn't just give out and throw itself down. But those bushings are tight enough that it should hold it up. So this is a 15mm socket. There's just 2 bolts here. Get on those. Remove that. And then just, hold this one up. If you want to put a stand underneath it, you can. See how it's fallen? And the bushings. And this is part of the reason why we were making sure that that CV wasn't stayed in there, because right now it'd be pretty tight on it. So the bushings are holding it up, and that's just why we removed everything for slack. So you should be good there. So now on the upper part of the strut, there's this little plastic cowl piece that has a bunch of wires and stuff in it. This is over top of our strut nuts on the rear one as well. So we just need to pop this off. So the best way is just take a pry bar, pop these off there. And the rear one, you can kind of see that silver aluminum foil looking thing. There's also one on the back of that. And so we'll have to pop that off as well. And that one is really tight, and it always is. So just be mindful of that, not to pinch any wires or break anything. Now you may be saying to yourself, why do I have the hood popped open here? Well, to remove one of these strut nuts here, It's very, very difficult from the underside to be able to remove it just because of all the wires and everything in the way. So from the top of the engine bay, we can actually access the nut here. So it's an 18 millimeter. You're gonna have to move that plastic out of the way like we did earlier. And I can kind of show you with my finger. It's just right down there. And you wanna do this first because if you don't have somebody to hold that strut, you don't wanna do that last and have the strut just fall out of there. So we're gonna take an extension, a swivel, 18 millimeter socket, fall off your ladder. And remove that. And try not to burn yourself because this is hot. Since you got that nut removed on the backside through the engine bay, we're gonna remove these two nuts here. Best way to do this, just because of everything that's going on, is an 18 millimeter ratcheting wrench. So go ahead and just ratchet these off. Now we're gonna remove the arm. You can see that we couldn't access it before with the strut being in there because the bolts run from in to out. So this is a 21 millimeter wrench and socket. So on the bolt head side, you're probably gonna have to use a short socket if you do have an impact. So go ahead and get your wrench and socket on there. Remove that side, and then when you go to loosen this side, just maybe hold the arm up a little bit with your arm because it will just plop down. You don't want it just falling on you. Like so. We're gonna just remove these nuts completely. Might have to shimmy the arm a little bit to get the bolts out. Pull that out. Pull your factory arm out. Now we will be replacing the factory control arm with our Adventure Series control arm. Now you can see aesthetically, ours is beefier and it is a lot beefier than the factory control arm. We also use factory style bushings and a heavy duty ball joint that is serviceable. And as well, to clean up the aesthetics, we provide you with this cap that goes on top of the ball joint cup to prevent dirt and debris from getting in that, so you don't have a bunch of gunk in there and not be able to service it when you need to. Now we do provide you with new hardware for the upper control arm. This is 14 millimeter 10.9. So we're gonna go ahead and install it just kind of how the factory one was. It might be a little tight. As well with the bolts, we also provide you with new washers and prevailing torque nuts here. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna start these for now. And you can snug them up, but do not completely tighten them just yet.
So now we'll work on disassembling the strut and installing the preload spacers in order so we can put it back into the truck. That way we can get the lift out of the preload spacers. So to do this, we're going to use a strut compressor. If you do not feel comfortable using a strut compressor or don't have access to one, you can either take the strut into an automotive repair shop or a local dealership to have them install this. Or you can take the vehicle in there, just because this is a little bit more complex type of tool to use. So you can see we already got it installed here, got the top part on. Now we're gonna remove a little bit of the preload on the spring, your 18 millimeter socket, and remove the strut. Set that aside. And next you're gonna back the preload all the way off. This is also, we can get this top mount off in order to install the preload spacers. So now with all the preload backed off the strut, you can take this top hat off. You'll have this bump stop, so you can set that aside. This washer may fall out as well. Set that aside just for later installation. In some cases, this spring isolator may still be attached, and you just tap on the edge or pry on the edge to get these two apart. Let's set that aside. So what we need to do now is we need to remove these struts. That way the preloaded spacer can go here. So we'll use a vise and just put it in between the vise. Make sure it's wide enough so that doesn't hit the vise. And then just take a hammer, or if you have a press or a tool like that, you can use it. We'll just tap the studs out. Now that we got the strut disassembled, as you can see, I'll walk you through why it's designed this way. So starting here, we're using a top spacer. This goes on top of the strut, so this will actually lengthen the overall assembly length. The reason we do a shorter top spacer than a traditional type of kit is because we don't want it to droop as far. As it droops further out, you can get the CV to start binding. So this will help keep your CV in check to keep the CV life as long as possible. In order to achieve the rest of the lift, you'll see we have these 2 preload spacers. Now there's 2 options here. You can either install just this thicker one or the pair as well. So this will give you kind of 2 options you can do for lift height. This will reduce your overall lift about a 1/2 inch. So a Chevy generally has around 1.25 inches of rake. So this will, without using this will kind of make it level. An AT4, you would want to use this because they generally have around 2 inches of rake. So what these will do, these will go inside the strut here. So these are what you call a preload spacer. So do the same thing, they provide lift, but they do it kind of in a safer manner in terms of not allowing it to droop as far. And what this will do is it'll compress your spring further inside the strut assembly. That way you can still get the lift that you desire, but still doing it correctly to keep all your CV angles, your ball joint angles, everything within check. All right, so now we're gonna assemble the preload spacers into the top hat. So you'll get the thicker preload spacer first, and then you'll line up the thinner preload spacer. In this case, we're gonna use the thinner one. The holes will only line up one way. So put them all together, then you'll take your bolt and drop it through. It'll recess into the preload spacer. So do that for all 3. And then next you'll take your upper spring mount, and this will also only install one way. You'll see these 2 nubs here. Those will line up in the 2 slots right there. So it'll all kind of lock in together. So next you'll flip it over like that. And you'll see there's a little notch here. It'll line up with the notch on the factory top hat. You drop all that in together. And that is the beginning of that upper assembly. So now we're going to take the spring and go to the strut compressor. We'll securely put it in. So in this kit, you're going to be adding preload. So if you already had the strut in there and left the spring in there, you'll have to compress it a little further since we're adding the preload. And these Chevys have very few coil windings, so it can be a little difficult to do at times. I'd recommend to put the top hat on right now, just because you may have interference here. That way it's in place, and this may get in the way later, so we'll put it on now. So make sure all your legs are secure onto it. So next we're going to install the strut. So first we'll go on your bump stop. Next you'll have this little spacer. You'll see a little ridge there. Make sure that goes down. It's the way it was factory. Grab your nut. Come over. Put it up through. So now we're just going to tighten it. This is an 18 millimeter. All right, next you got to make sure your lower mount is lined up to the upper. And how to do that is you'll find this little nub from earlier right there, and it needs to face essentially the strut. So you'll rotate it around. You'll see like the Rancho sticker actually faces that little nub. And then after that, remove it from the strut compressor. So after we got the strut assembled out of the strut compressor, the nut torqued to spec, we will put the top spacer on, and that just simply lines up. Again, you'll line it up the nub with that nub, and then it's ready to go in the truck as it sits.
Now once you install your arm into the frame with the bolts that we provide, you're going to go ahead and install it into the factory knuckle. Now you can see here, this is the factory nut off the original factory arm. Make sure that when we do this step, that you are putting this factory nut. Do not use the nut we provide yet. You can also see there's no strut in here. So what we're doing here is with the strut in, we cannot tighten our new control arm bolts. So we have to cycle up to where ride height is going to be and torque these bolts to the proper torque so they're tight and they're not bound up while tight at the wrong spot. So what we're going to do here is, here we already set it. In our case, it's 25 and 5/8 from hub to fender just like when you get your ride height measurements, our instructions do say what the measurement is, but every vehicle might vary just a little bit. So you're just adding whatever your kit is. So in this case, it's an 1 3/4 inch kit. We're adding 1 3/4 to our original ride height, and that's where we get our measurement here. The torque for this is 126 foot-pounds, and you're gonna need a 22 millimeter socket and wrench. So you're probably gonna have to have a buddy. So the best way to do this is, you can see they're still loose back here. Best way is the first, there is a lot of tightening with that torque wrench, so you want to snug this up with an impact. Do not go hammer down on it, just enough to get it started so you don't have to wrench as much with the torque wrench. So go ahead and just tighten them up a little bit and do that each side. Now you're just gonna have a helping hand, and they're gonna hold the nut side for you, because this is a lot of force to tighten this bolt, and it may be kind of a pain because of how everything is kind of laid out here. You might have to spin stuff. So once again, 22 millimeter wrench and socket, and just kind of go until you hear your torque wrench click, and it does get really tight because of that nut. Now once you got your arms torqued and tightened up, we're gonna remove our factory ball joint nut here from our arm. So we're gonna take an 18 millimeter socket, remove this. Remember, don't remove it completely like I just did, because it might be in there pretty tight. Take a hammer, whack the side of the knuckle, and pop that ball joint out of there. And you can either press up on the knuckle or press down on the arm to be able to get the tension off to remove that nut. It's kind of the same thing like we did earlier, just let that arm kind of just dangle there. Now we're gonna take our modified strut. We're gonna take your provided nuts and washers here. Just same orientation. Just find the holes, washer, and then nut. Now one of our factory lower strut bolts has to be modified just due to clearance issues. So this bolt is fully threaded. So basically measure from the bottom of this little washer here and make it 2 3/8, and that's kind of where I marked right there. It's just a little bit past where the threads end on the end of the bolt. You can kind of do this one of two ways. Best way is just put it in a vise and use a cutoff wheel. Be super careful. Make sure you wear eye protection. And we're just gonna hack that off. If you make it a little shorter, it's not gonna hurt anything, but just make sure you try to make it at least close to where you marked. Make sure you make it as straight as you can too, so you don't have burrs, so it's easy to start that. So go ahead and just. Now you don't want to tighten your top strut nuts just yet, because we want to be able to kind of maneuver it how we want to be able to hook this arm up to it. So just take your factory bolt. Remember, the modified one goes on the inside by the CV. That's for the clearance there. Start your unmodified one, get your modified one, and start it up. And just take your 15 millimeter socket and tighten these up. Now that you have those snugged up, we're gonna go and tighten our 2 strut nuts that we can reach on the outside here. So this is a 17 millimeter ratcheting wrench. Just tighten that up, and you'll be able to watch this whole thing kind of pull itself up as we start to tighten it. Now, just like before, we're gonna go and tighten our nut that's in the engine bay. Once again, this is gonna be a 17 millimeter socket with a swivel and extension. Find where it sits at here. Next step, we're going to install our upper ball joint into our factory knuckle here. So you will have to pry down on this because of how tight we made those arms. And in this case, we provide you with a new nylock nut. So the reason we provide you with a new nylock nut is because we use it twice and it will ruin the nylock, so it might not be as strong as what it once was. So we're going to give you a new one here, and this will just thread onto the ball joint. And then you're going to take a 19 millimeter socket with a swivel and tighten that up. You just want to make sure that the threads are through the nut and through the nylock there, which they are. When you install your upper control arm, make sure that your CV does slide into the splines in the bearing. Put your factory nut back on, take your 36 millimeter socket. Our next step is we're going to take our caliper and put it back onto our rotor and knuckle here. Factory bolts, make sure you Loctite those bolts and put both of those in. Get them both started before you tighten the other one down. Then just take an 18 millimeter socket snug one up. And tighten the other one down. And go back and hit the other one. Now we're just gonna route our brake lines and our ABS lines back to where they were in the factory position. Make sure that you Loctite these bolts. Put them all back, just in their factory spots where the knuckle was. And the ABS one is the only one that is different. It is just a little bit shorter than the rest of the bolts. Just slap that in there. Now just tighten all those bolts up that you put in your knuckle. Don't tighten them up too tight because you don't want to break them. Now on the factory arm, there was a bolt that went on the top of the arm with this little bracket here. You can see that there's just these little rubber grommets here that kind of hold that on. So pull that off and get rid of that bracket. We provide you with this wire clamp. So you can see this little tab here on the bottom of the arm. You're just gonna take that wire clamp, pinch it over the line. We give you new hardware here and put it through that hole on the arm, and then just start your nut and washer here. Now you can just tighten up that bolt with that wire clamp. This is going to be a 7/16 socket and wrench. And just go ahead and tighten that up. When you are tightening, just make sure that the wire clamp kind of goes up and down so it doesn't pull on that cable. That's just to stop it from hitting everything. Now we're going to take our tie rod end, put it back into our knuckle, our factory nut, 22mm socket, tighten that down. Now remember I said earlier about how we have these caps? These caps come with O-rings for the upper control arm. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to install the O-ring into the groove on the cap. It sits in like that. And you're going to want to put a little bit of grease on the O-ring, and that's just for one, to not damage it when you're installing it, and two, makes it a little bit easier to get off when you go to service your ball joint. You don't have to put a lot, just enough to get around all the sides. Once you have that greased up, take your grease gun and put grease in your upper ball joint. Just a couple clicks here. In our case, we did have to wipe some of our grease off, so we're just gonna put a little bit more. Pull that off, clean up the grease. I like to leave it a little bit, some on the grease fitting just to show that I did grease it so I remember. And you can see there's little notches here on this cap. I like to put that out just for when you go to service it, you can just pop right on that and then just take your fist, pop it down. Now one of our last steps on the front here is we're gonna go ahead and install our sway bar links into our lower control arms. You can do this, you know, as you're putting together the sides, but it's a lot easier just to pull down on them together. It is easier with two people doing them each side, but just line them up, pull down, hold it down, put your nut on this side. That should hold it. Put your nut on that side. 18mm socket. Tighten both of those up. And that's how you install a 1 3/4 inch lift kit on a 2022 Trail Boss diesel. Now you want to make sure that you do get an alignment and torque all your bolts to proper specifications. If you have any more questions, go to zoneoffroad.com.